The man in the shadow stay began quietly for Sundar Pichai. The morning sun floated gently above the horizon, casting golden light over the busy streets of San Francisco. He sat at the window of his modest apartment sipping tea, his mind already spinning with meetings and deadlines. He had built his life around technology and progress. But today, something tugged at his thoughts differently. That as he watched people rushing below, he noticed a frail old man sitting on the corner near a faded brick building. Sundar had seen many homeless people on his morning walks, but there was something about this man that felt different. He wore an old, worn coat that didn't fit properly, and his eyes, though weary, seemed full of stories. Sundar finished his tea, grabbed his bag, and decided to take the long route to work. Something inside told him he needed to see this man closer. As he approached, the smell of damp earth and stale bread filled the air. The man was humming softly to himself, staring at his hands, which were shaking slightly. "Good morning," Sundar said gently. The man looked up, startled at first, but then nodded with a faint smile. "Morning, son," he replied, his voice rough yet kind. "Are you okay? Do you need anything?" Sundar asked. The old man paused for a long moment before answering. "People walk by every day. Nobody asks. You ask. That means something," he said. "I'm all right, just tired." Sundar didn't know why, but he sat down beside the man, ignoring the curious looks from passers-by. "What's your name?" "Arthur," the man replied. "Arthur Kane." Arthur. The name sounded heavy with history. Sundar noticed a metal pin to his coat, almost hidden under the fabric. It was old, scratched, but unmistakably a Purple Heart. Sundar's breath caught in his chest. "You're a veteran?" Sundar asked softly. Arthur chuckled dryly. "Was long ago. World War II. Feels like another lifetime." "Thank you for your service," Sundar said sincerely. Arthur nodded faintly. "Not many say that anymore." The morning air grew colder, and Sundar couldn't shake the thought that this man, this hero, was sitting here on the street, forgotten. He wanted to help, but he didn't yet know how. He offered Arthur some money, but the man gently pushed his hand away. "Don't need your money, son, not yet, just someone to talk to." And so, Sundar stayed. They talked about little things at first, the weather, the noise of the city, but soon Arthur began to share pieces of his past. He spoke of his childhood, of being drafted at 18, of battles fought in France and Germany. His voice trembled. When he mentioned losing friends in the war, he told Sundar about coming home to a country that had already moved on, about struggling to find work, about being forgotten. "One day you're a hero," Arthur said, staring at the ground. "The next day, you're nothing, invisible." Sundar felt a lump in his throat. How could someone who gave so much end up like this? Just then, a woman walked by and sneered at Arthur, muttering something cruel about homeless people. Fists clenched, but Arthur only sighed and looked away. "I'm used to it," he whispered. That moment stayed with Sundar all day. Through his meetings, through his emails, through the noise of his busy life, he couldn't stop thinking about Arthur. That evening, as the city lights glowed like stars below him, Sundar sat in his office alone. He thought about his own journey. He came from a small home in India. How many people had helped him along the way? How lucky he was. And he thought about Arthur, who had nobody. The next morning, he returned to the same corner. Arthur was still there, sitting quietly. "You came back," Arthur said, almost surprised. "Of course," Sundar replied. "I was hoping you'd tell me more about your story." Arthur's eyes softened, and for the first time, he smiled fully. "Not many people care about my story anymore." "I care," Sundar said. And so, for the next hour, Arthur told him more about the letters he used to write home, about the family he lost touch with, about the dreams he once had. Sundar listened, carefully, feeling the weight of each word. He didn't interrupt, didn't rush. When it grew late, Sundar stood to leave, but promised to return. "Tomorrow," he said. "Same time." Arthur nodded. "You're a good man, son. Thank you." But as Sundar walked away, he felt uneasy. Something in Arthur's eyes that day seemed darker, sadder than before. The next morning, Sundar arrived earlier, but Arthur wasn't there. The corner was empty. He waited and waited. The minutes turned into an hour, the hour into 2. Still, no sign of Arthur. Sundar asked a nearby shopkeeper if she'd seen the old man. She shook her head. "He's gone," Sundar asked, his voice tight. "Maybe," the woman said. "Sometimes they just disappear. Nobody notices." But Sundar noticed. He began walking up and down the nearby streets, searching. His heart pounded, harder with each step. He couldn't explain it, but he felt responsible. He couldn't just let Arthur vanish. Finally, he spotted something, a scrap of the same worn coat, caught on a fence behind an alley. Sundar rushed over and found footprints in the dirt, leading to a small, abandoned building. The door was half open. Sundar pushed it gently, and the smell of dust and mold hit him. "Arthur," he called softly. There was no answer. He stepped inside. The room was dim, with cracked walls and broken furniture. In the corner, Sundar saw a figure slumped against the wall. "Arthur!" He ran to him. Arthur's eyes fluttered open, weak but alive. His breathing was shallow. In his hand, he clutched a photograph faded and torn of a young woman and a child. They gone, Arthur whispered, his voice barely audible. Sundar's chest tightened. He didn't know what to do, but he knew he couldn't leave him here. He pulled out his phone, dialing for help, but before he could speak, Arthur's hand shot out, gripping his arm weakly. Please, Arthur whispered. Don't tell anyone yet. Just listen. And then Arthur began to speak. He told Sundar a secret, something he'd never told anyone before, something so shocking, so heartbreaking, that Sundar felt the room spin around him. And when Arthur finished, he looked at Sundar with tears in his eyes and said, "You have to promise me. Promise you won't walk away." Sundar swallowed hard, his own eyes burning. "I promise," he said quietly, but in the silence that followed, he realized he had no idea what he'd just promised to. And outside, in the dark alleyway, a shadow moved. Someone had been watching them the whole time. The secret in the photograph. Air inside the abandoned building felt heavier now. Sundar sat on the cold, cracked floor, staring at Arthur, who lay weakly against the wall. The dim light from the doorway barely reached them, casting long trembling shadows. Sundar could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, louder than anything else. Arthur's hand still clutched the old photograph tightly, as if it were the only thing keeping him alive. His breathing was shallow, but steady enough for now. Sundar didn't dare speak yet. He simply stayed there, waiting for Arthur to gather enough strength to finish what he had started to say. Outside, the faint sound of footsteps scraping against gravel echoed softly, then disappeared again. Sundar glanced at the doorway. The memory of that shadow he had seen moments ago still fresh in his mind. Someone had been there. Someone was watching. But who, and why? Arthur coughed, a deep, rattling sound that broke the silence. He slowly opened his eyes again and looked at Sundar. "Thank you for staying," he whispered hoarsely. "Of course," Sundar said gently. "I promised. I'm here." Arthur nodded faintly and then, after a long pause, held the photograph up toward Sundar. His hand trembled so much that Sundar had to reach forward and help him keep it steady. "My wife and my boy," Arthur murmured, his voice breaking at the edges. Sundar looked closely at the photograph. It was yellowed with age, corners torn, but the image was still clear enough. A young woman stood in a garden, smiling softly, holding the hand of a small boy who couldn't have been more than 4 years old. They both wore clothes from another era, clean and proper, but modest. "They looked happy," Sundar said quietly. Arthur's lips curved into the faintest smile. "They were my whole world," he said. But then his eyes clouded, and his voice dropped to a whisper. "Until the day they disappeared." Sundar froze. "Disappeared?" Arthur nodded slowly. "After the war, I came home. I thought we'd pick up where we left off. But one morning, they were just gone." Sundar's mind raced. "What do you mean? Did anyone look for them? The police family?" Arthur closed his eyes, and tears began to slip down his cheeks. "They told me it was an accident. They said the house burned, that there was nothing left. But I know that was a lie. I saw things. I heard things. There was someone following me, even back then." His voice cracked, and he gripped Sundar's sleeve weakly. "Someone took them from me, and I couldn't stop it." Sundar felt a chill crawl up his spine. The weight of Arthur's words sank into him, heavy and unsettling. "Why would someone do that?" Sundar asked softly. Arthur shook his head. "I don't know, but I think they're still out there, watching me even now." Sundar thought of the shadow outside. "Who?" he asked carefully. Arthur didn't answer at first. His eyes darted toward the doorway, and he lowered his voice to a whisper. "They're everywhere. They never let me rest. That's why I sleep on the streets. It's harder for them to find me if I keep moving." Sundar swallowed hard. He wanted to dismiss it as paranoia, but the way Arthur said it, calm, certain, broken, made it impossible to ignore. "Arthur," he said gently, "why didn't you tell anyone before? Someone could have helped you." Arthur let out a bitter laugh. "I tried. Nobody believed me. They said I was sick, crazy, but I know what I saw." And now, he trailed off, his gaze shifting to the doorway again. Sundar followed his eyes, but saw nothing this time. Still, the back of his neck tingled. "Now what?" Sundar pressed. Arthur took a deep breath and whispered something that made Sundar's blood run cold. "They don't want me to talk, but I think maybe you're the one who can finish what I started." Sundar stared at him, stunned. "What do you mean?" Arthur's hand tightened around Sundar's. "I kept something they're looking for. I hid it all these years. If they find it before you do, everything will be lost." Sundar felt his throat dry up. "What is it?" Arthur tried to answer, but just then, a loud crash outside made them both jump. Sundar stood up quickly, his heart pounding. "Wait here," he told Arthur, moving toward the doorway. Outside, the alley was empty, but the air felt different, colder, sharper. The faint smell of cigarette smoke lingered, and a shadow flickered near the end of the alley before vanishing into the darkness. Sundar took a step forward but stopped when he heard Arthur's voice behind him. "Don't chase them," Arthur warned, his tone urgent. "That's what they want. They want you to follow. Sundar turned back, confused. Arthur's eyes burned with quiet intensity. Listen to me. In my coat pocket, there's a key. Take it. Sundar reached into the coat and felt a small, cold metal key tucked inside the lining. He pulled it out and examined it, plain old, but engraved with a number. What does it open? Sundar asked. Arthur exhaled slowly. A locker, train station, under the name Kane. Sundar stared at the key, a strange weight settling over him. You have to get there before they do, Arthur said firmly. Sundar nodded faintly, tucking the key into his pocket. But before he could say anything else, Arthur's body slumped against the wall. His eyes fluttered shut, and his breathing grew shallow again. Arthur, Sundar called softly, panic rising in his chest. Arthur didn't answer. Sundar knelt down, shaking him gently. Arthur, stay with me. But just then, Sundar heard footsteps. In the alley, again, faster this time. Closer. He looked up and saw a figure standing at the end of the alley, half hidden in shadow, tall, still, watching. For a long moment, the figure didn't move. Then, slowly, it raised one hand pointing directly at Sundar before vanishing into the darkness. Sundar's breath caught in his throat. He turned back to Arthur, whose lips moved faintly as he whispered one final thing. You must finish what I couldn't. And then Arthur's hand fell limp against the floor. Sundar felt his chest tighten. He checked for a pulse. Faint, still there, but fading fast. He pulled out his phone, dialing emergency services with trembling hands. Please, he said into the phone, his voice breaking. Send help. Now, as he waited for the ambulance, he glanced down at the key in his palm. The engraved number glinted in the dim light, and something about it made his stomach twist. He didn't know what was waiting for him at that train station. But he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't walk away now. And somewhere, in the shadows beyond the alley, he felt the eyes still watching him. He didn't know who they were, how far they would go to stop him. But he could feel it already. This was just the beginning. Asterisk, the locker beneath the city's sound of sirens cut through the heavy silence of the alleyway as Sundar stood there, his breath coming in uneven waves. He didn't move, not even when the flashing red lights bounced off the brick walls around him. Paramedics rushed past him, their voices urgent but distant, as if muffled by a thick fog. His eyes stayed locked on the key in his palm, its edges digging into his skin. It felt heavier now, as though it carried more than just metal. Arthur was lifted gently onto a stretcher, still unconscious but alive. Sundar watched as they wheeled him into the back of the ambulance, the door slamming shut with a dull finality. He wanted to follow, to stay by Arthur's side, but a strange certainty settled in his chest. Arthur wanted him to finish this. The man's last words still echoed in his mind. You must finish what I see. OULDN. Single quotes. Sundar slipped the key into his pocket, its cold presence pressing against his leg like a silent promise. He glanced once more at the shadowy end of the alley, but whoever had been watching was gone now. Nothing moved except the trash stirring lightly in the wind. The paramedics gave him a curt nod before driving away into the night, leaving Sundar standing alone under the sickly yellow glow of a street lamp. He looked around, feeling the weight of unseen eyes still on him, and then he turned toward the distant shape of the train station. His hands trembled slightly as he walked, but his steps were steady. The streets grew quieter the closer he got to the station. Neon signs flickered above empty storefronts, and stray cats darted between piles of garbage. The city, usually alive with chatter and laughter at this hour, now felt like a hollow shell, silent. Watching every sound behind him made him glance back, footsteps that might have been nothing, the faint scrape of metal against stone, whispers that faded before he could understand them. By the time he reached the train station, his heart was pounding so hard it drowned out everything else. The building loomed ahead, its grand archway cracked and darkened with age. Only a few lights glowed weakly inside, casting long shadows on the tiled floor. The air smelled faintly of oil, dust, and something else he couldn't quite name, something sharp, almost metallic. Sundar stepped inside. The station was nearly empty at this hour. A few tired travelers dozed on wooden benches, their bags clutched tightly to their chests. A ticket clerk behind a glass window stared blankly at a newspaper, oblivious to the world. The silence inside felt heavier than outside, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. He pulled the key from his pocket and stared at the number engraved on it, -1437. He walked slowly toward the rows of lockers lining the far wall, each painted a dull gray and marked with fading numbers. The closer he got, the more aware he became of his surroundings. Every creak of the floor seemed to echo. Every cough from a stranger felt like a warning. He stopped in front of locker 1437. The number was scratched and chipped, but still visible. The key felt icy in his fingers as he slid it into the lock. For a moment, it didn't turn. Then with a soft click, it gave way. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dusty metal box inside. Sundar's breath caught in his throat as he carefully lifted it out. It wasn't heavy, but the way it sat in his hands made it feel fragile, as though whatever it contained could change everything. He looked around quickly. Nobody seemed to be watching him. Yet, the hairs on the back of his neck still stood on end. He carried the box to a quiet corner of the station, sitting on a bench where the shadows were deeper. He placed the box on his lap and slowly opened it. Inside was a single envelope, thick with papers, and on top of the envelope was another photograph, this one of Arthur in uniform, younger, his face solemn and proud. But behind him, barely noticeable, stood another man, tall, dark eyes, sharp features, and a faint smirk on his lips that sent a shiver down Sundar's spine. Sundar turned the photograph over. Written in faint, shaky handwriting were just 3 words. He knows everything. Swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he reached for the envelope beneath the photograph. He carefully opened it and slid out a stack of yellowed documents. His eyes darted over the pages. Old military records, letters, newspaper clippings. At first, none of it made sense. But then, as he read deeper, a pattern began to emerge. There were reports of missing soldiers, secret missions that had never been officially recorded, mentions of experimental projects during the war, words like classified and deniable scribbled in red ink. And over, the same name kept appearing, Miles Rutherford. Sundar froze. He flipped back to the photograph. The man standing behind Arthur, the one with the sharp eyes and unsettling smirk. Written in small print at the bottom corner of the photo was a single word, Rutherford. Sundar's mind raced. Was this the man who had taken Arthur's family? Was this the one who had been following him all these years? As he sifted through the documents, he found a final sheet at the bottom of the stack, a torn piece of stationery with a single sentence written in hurried, shaky handwriting. If you find this, they already know. Run. His blood ran cold. He shoved the documents back into the envelope and slipped it into his bag. The box clanged softly as he closed it, but nobody in the station seemed to notice. And yet, he felt it eyes on him. He stood up slowly, scanning the station. A man in a long coat stood near the exit, half hidden in the shadows, staring directly at him. When their eyes met, the man's lips curved into that same faint smirk from the photograph. Sundar's stomach dropped. He clutched his bag tighter and turned toward the side door, forcing his legs to move. He could hear footsteps now, quiet but deliberate. Following him, he slipped through the door into a narrow hallway lined with vending machines. The fluorescent lights above flickered weakly, casting everything in an eerie, bluish glow. His breath came faster now, clouding in front of him, behind him. The footsteps grew louder. He glanced over his shoulder and saw the man in the long coat step into the hallway. Still smirking, still calm, Sundar quickened his pace, heart hammering. He pushed through another door at the end of the hall and found himself in the back of the station, where the trains waited. The platform stretched out before him, empty except for a single train, idling quietly at the far end. Its doors stood open, waiting. He ran toward it, the sound of his shoes on the concrete echoing like gunshots. Just as he reached the doors, a sharp voice called out behind him. "You can't run forever." Sundar froze. Slowly, he turned. The man in the coat stood at the edge of the platform, his eyes dark and steady, the faintest hint of amusement in his expression. "You don't know what you've gotten yourself into," the man said, his voice, calm, almost kind. "Give me the envelope and walk away. You don't have to end up like him." Sundar's fingers tightened around the strap of his bag. His heart raced, but he forced himself to stand straighter. "Who are you?" Sundar asked, his voice low. The man tilted his head slightly, the smirk never leaving his face. "Just someone cleaning up old messes," he said. Sundar took a step back. Closer to the train door, the man's expression hardened. "Just for a moment. Don't make this harder than it has to be," he said. The train let out a loud hiss as the doors began to close. Sundar made a split-second decision. He jumped through the door just before it shut behind him. He stumbled into the empty carriage, his chest heaving, and watched through the window as the man stood there on the platform, still watching him. And then, for the first time, the man spoke without a smirk, his lips forming a single, chilling word, though Sundar couldn't hear it through the glass. He understood. Run. The train lurched forward, pulling out of the station and into the dark tunnels beyond. Sundar sank into a seat, his hands shaking, the envelope pressed tightly to his chest. But even as the train carried him away, he knew this wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The code in the letter strain rattled through the dark tunnels, its wheels screeching softly on the rails, as Sundar sat hunched in his seat, the envelope clutched tightly to his chest. He could still see the man on the platform in his mind, the faint smirk gone, replaced by something far more unsettling. The way he had mouthed that single word, "run," echoed in Sundar's head over and over. He tried to steady his breathing as he stared at the envelope on his lap. His fingers traced the edge of it almost unconsciously. It felt impossibly heavy, as though it contained not just paper but an entire world of secrets. Through the window, he could see the faint blur of graffiti rushing past, lights flickering and casting strange shadows across his face. The carriage was nearly empty, except for an older woman sleeping near the back and a man with headphones staring blankly at the floor. They didn't seem to notice him, didn't seem to care about the bag he held so close. But Sundar couldn't shake the feeling of being watched even here. Every reflection in the glass, every flicker of movement in his peripheral vision made his stomach tighten. Finally, the train screeched to a stop at an unfamiliar station, and Sundar slipped off quietly, pulling his collar higher to hide his face. The streets above were damp with recent rain, the air sharp and full of the smell of wet concrete. He walked quickly, not daring to stop until he reached a small, quiet cafe tucked between two shuttered shops. Inside, the lights were dim, and the smell of coffee clung to everything. Only a few customers sat scattered around, their heads bent over phones and cups. Sundar slid into a booth in the far corner, where the shadows were deeper, and placed the envelope on the table in front of him. For a long moment, he just stared at it. His mind raced with questions he didn't know how to ask, let alone answer. Who was Miles Rutherford? What had Arthur really uncovered? And most frightening of all, why was it so important that someone would chase him through the night for it? His hands trembled slightly as he opened the envelope again. He pulled out the photograph first, staring at Rutherford's face. The dark eyes, the faint smirk. Now that Sundar had seen him in person, the photograph felt even more sinister. Then he turned to the stack of papers. He spread them out slowly on the table, careful not to draw attention. There were military records, typed letters, and newspaper clippings, just as before. But now that he had time to really look, he began noticing details he hadn't before. Numbers scribbled in the margins, words underlined faintly in pencil, strange symbols drawn in the corners of some pages. At first, it seemed random, but then something clicked. He pulled one letter closer, a short note dated 1946. Addressed to Arthur, do not trust the official story. The files are incomplete. Follow the numbers. You'll understand when you see it. His eyes darted back to the scribbled numbers on the margins of the other pages. They weren't random after all. They were coordinates. Or at least, that's what they looked like. But coordinates to what? His heart pounded harder as he flipped through more documents. The pattern repeated. Numbers, symbols, words, circled, faintly as though trying to guide him somewhere, then hidden at the bottom of the stack. He found something new, a torn piece of paper with a short message scrawled in shaky handwriting. The bunker holds everything. But beware, not all of them left when the war ended. Sundar's hands went cold. The bunker. He leaned back in the booth, trying to calm his racing thoughts. So Arthur had discovered some kind of hidden bunker, and whatever was inside was enough to haunt him for decades, to make him live in fear, to make strangers chase him through the streets. Even now, Sundar pulled out his phone and quickly typed the numbers into a map app. His breath caught when he saw where they led, a stretch of forest far outside the city, near the coast. No roads marked, no towns nearby, just a wide expanse of green with nothing but a faint, winding trail cutting through it. As he stared at the screen, he felt a strange mixture of fear and determination settle in his chest. He didn't know what waited for him in that forest, but he knew he had to find it. He gathered the papers back into the envelope and slipped it into his bag. Just as the bell over the cafe door jingled softly, he froze. Two men in long coats stepped inside, their eyes scanning the room. They moved with quiet precision, their gazes sharp, their faces unreadable. One of them, the taller of the two, had the same dark eyes and faint smirk as Rutherford in the photograph. Sundar's blood turned to ice. He kept his head down. Sliding out of the booth as quietly as he could, he moved toward the back of the cafe, where a narrow hallway led to the restrooms and a service exit. But as he slipped through the door and into the alley behind the cafe, he caught a glimpse of the taller man turning his head just slightly and smiling. The alley was slick with rainwater and smelled faintly of trash and cigarette smoke. Sundar's shoes splashed softly as he walked quickly toward the end, glancing over his shoulder every few steps. He could hear the cafe door open behind him, quiet but deliberate. He turned a corner and found himself on a quiet side street. A single taxi idled near the curb, its driver dozing in the front seat. Sundar rushed over and tapped the window. "Please," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Take me to the edge of the forest by the coast." Now, the driver blinked in surprise but nodded, unlocking the door. Sundar slid inside and kept his eyes on the rearview mirror as they pulled away. Behind them, at the mouth of the alley, the two men stood side by side, watching silently as the taxi disappeared into the distance. The ride was long and quiet, the city falling away behind them as they drove deeper into the countryside. The lights of buildings gave way to long stretches of darkness, broken only by the faint glow of the moon above. Sundar stared out the window, his mind swirling with everything he'd learned. The missing family, the hidden bunker, the coded letters, and the man who seemed to appear wherever he went. At last, the taxi rolled to a stop at the edge of the forest. The driver gave him a puzzled look but didn't ask questions. Sundar paid him and stepped out into the cool night air. The trees loomed tall and silent before him, their branches swaying gently in the wind. A faint path led into the shadows. just as the map had shown. He took a deep breath, adjusted the strap of his bag, and started walking. The forest was darker than he expected, the canopy above blocking out much of the moonlight. The air smelled of earth and pine, and the only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath his feet and the distant hoot of an owl. As he followed the trail deeper into the woods, the trees grew closer together, their trunks twisting like silent sentinels. Every so often, he glanced behind him, half expecting to see someone there. But the path remained empty. After what felt like hours, he reached a small clearing where the ground dipped slightly, forming a shallow depression. At the center stood a rusted metal hatch, half hidden by moss and leaves. His breath caught the bunker. He approached slowly, his hand shaking as he reached down to brush away the debris. The hatch was cold to the touch, and a faint symbol had been scratched into its surface, the same symbol he had seen, drawn in the margins of the papers. He gripped the handle and pulled. It groaned loudly but gave way, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The air that rose from below was damp and smelled faintly of rust and something else, something he couldn't quite name. He pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight, the beam cutting weakly through the thick shadows. He hesitated at the top of the stairs, listening. Somewhere far below, he thought he heard something move, a faint scraping sound, followed by a whisper. His heart slammed against his ribs, but he forced himself to take the first step down, then another, and another. The air grew colder with each step, and the walls narrowed around him, the silence pressing in from all sides. Finally he reached the bottom. The corridor stretched out before him, lined with rusted doors and broken lights. The walls were covered in faded writing, strange diagrams, and deep scratches, as though someone or something had tried to claw its way out. He took a cautious step forward, then another. He passed a door that stood ajar, and as he peered inside, his blood ran cold. The room was filled with rows of metal beds, each with restraints dangling from the sides. On the far wall hung photographs, black and white, blurry, of people with hollow eyes, staring blankly into the camera. And written across the wall, in dark, jagged letters, were two chilling words: "Still here." Sundar's breath caught in his throat. He spun around, suddenly aware of just how quiet it had become. Then, from somewhere deeper in the bunker, a loud clang echoed through the corridor. He froze. The sound came again, closer this time, a faint shuffling, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Not hurried, not afraid, just deliberate. Sundar backed toward the staircase, but the beam of his flashlight caught something moving at the end of the corridor. A figure. Tall, still. Watching him. He took a step back, his heart hammering so loudly he could barely hear anything else. Then the figure began to walk toward him, slow and steady, and as it moved closer, Sundar finally saw its face, and everything he thought he knew shattered in an instant. The face in the dark figure at the end of the corridor stopped moving, but the faint echo of its footsteps still hung in the damp air. Sundar stood frozen, his back pressed against the cold concrete wall. His flashlight beam trembled slightly in his hand, the narrow cone of light revealing just enough to make his stomach twist. The face that emerged from the darkness was pale, lined, and unmistakable. Even in the dim light, Sundar recognized it instantly. It was Arthur. But not the Arthur he had spoken to on the street corner. Not the frail, trembling man who sat alone with his memories. This Arthur stood straighter, his eyes cold and unblinking, his mouth a thin grim line. His uniform was immaculate, though impossibly outdated, and the faint metal on his chest caught the light as though polished that morning. Sundar's breath caught in his throat. He tried to speak, but no sound came out. Arthur's eyes met his, and for a long, heavy moment, neither of them moved. The silence pressed in all around, the only sound the faint dripping of water somewhere deeper in the bunker. Then, slowly, Arthur tilted his head. "You came," he said at last, his voice low, calm, and nothing like the man Sundar had known. Swallowed hard, finally managing to whisper, How are you here?" "You were." Arthur cut him off with a faint shake of his head. "Don't ask questions you don't want the answers to." Sundar's chest tightened. The light from his flashlight shook slightly as he took an instinctive step back. Arthur's gaze followed him, unblinking. "You have the envelope," Arthur continued, his voice echoing faintly against the concrete walls. "They let you get this far because they want you to open it here. They want you to see what's inside." Sundar's fingers tightened around the strap of his bag, his pulse hammering in his ears. "Why?" he managed to ask. Arthur's single quotes lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Because once you see it, you can't leave." The words sank into Sundar like a stone in water. His mind raced. He thought of the documents, the coded letters, the photograph of Rutherford, and the words "still here" scrawled across the wall. He thought of Arthur on the stretcher, weak and broken, and yet here he was, standing before him in the depths of the bunker. Arthur stepped closer, the sound of his boots on the concrete unnervingly deliberate. "You don't understand yet," he said, his voice soft now. "This place, it's not just a bunker, it's a vault. For everything they couldn't destroy. For everyone they couldn't control. He gestured faintly to the corridor behind him, where the rusted doors stretched out like the ribs of some long-dead creature. They thought if they locked it all down here, the world would forget. But the world doesn't forget. The world remembers. Sundar's breath came faster now. "Why are you here?" he asked again, his voice almost breaking. Arthur finally stopped walking. He stood just a few feet away now, his shadow long and strange in the flickering light. "Because someone has to make sure it doesn't get out," he said simply. He turned his head slightly, and Sundar followed his gaze to one of the rusted doors halfway down the corridor. Unlike the others, this one was newer, reinforced, and chained shut with thick, heavy links. Faint scratches marred the metal surface, and the air around it felt colder somehow, sharper. "What's in there?" Sundar whispered. Arthur's expression darkened. "The end," he said softly. Sundar swallowed hard, his legs stiff as he forced himself to move closer to the door. The chains clinked faintly as he reached out and touched the cold metal. His flashlight beam revealed faint words scratched into the surface, hard to read, but still there. "We are still." Harij turned back to Arthur, who was watching him closely now. "What happened here?" Sundar asked. Arthur was silent for a long time, then finally said, "They tried to change us, to make us better, faster, smarter. Weapons, they called us, not soldiers, not men, just weapons." His voice cracked faintly on the last word, and, for a fleeting second, Sundar saw something, grief, or rage, or maybe both, flash across his face. Arthur stepped closer to the chained door, his gloved hand resting on it gently. "But we were still human," he whispered. "And humans, don't forget." The words hung in the air like smoke. Sundar felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. "And Rutherford?" he asked. Arthur, single quotes, eyes hardened. "He made us this way," he said, "and when he saw what we became, he tried to bury it. But you can't bury the truth forever." He turned to Sundar now, his face pale but resolute. "That's why you're here. You have to finish it. Burn it all. Lock it down. Don't let them wake again." Sundar opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a deafening clang rang out behind them. Both men froze. Another clang followed, louder this time coming from the chained door. Sundar's eyes widened as the chains rattled violently, the sound of metal grinding against metal filling the corridor. The cold air grew colder, biting into his skin like knives. Arthur stepped back, his expression grim. "It's too late," he murmured. The door shuddered again, and a low guttural sound, not quite a growl, not quite a scream, rose from the other side. Sundar stumbled back, his heart hammering against his ribs as the flashlight beam danced wildly across the walls. "What is that?" he demanded, his voice cracking. Arthur's gaze stayed fixed on the door. "Us," he whispered. "What's left of us." With a sharp, metallic snap, one of the chains broke free, whipping through the air and clattering to the floor. The sound echoed through the bunker like a gunshot. Sundar took another step back. But Arthur didn't move. The remaining chains groaned under the pressure, the door itself buckling slightly as whatever was behind it pushed harder. The sound grew louder now, filling the corridor with a noise that made Sundar's blood turn to ice. Arthur turned his head just enough to look at Sundar one last time. "You need to run," he said softly. "Now?" But Sundar stood rooted to the spot, his flashlight flickering as the second chain snapped and fell to the floor. The door creaked open an inch, and through the gap, a pale clawed hand, human but not, slipped through, the fingers curling against the concrete. And then, in a single, shattering moment, the door burst open, and the darkness beyond surged forward. Sundar's scream was swallowed by the roar that filled the bunker, and as the thing stepped into the light, he realized with dawning horror that it was looking directly at him. The fire, and the silence roar of the creature filled the corridor like a living thing, echoing off the bunker walls and crawling under Sundar's skin. It wasn't just sound, it was grief, rage, pain, and something worse. It was human, and not human at all. The thing that stepped through the broken door was tall and twisted, its limbs too long, its back hunched beneath scarred flesh. Its skin was pale, stretched tight over sharp bones, and where its eyes should have been, there were only deep, sunken hollows. Yet it looked at Sundar. It saw him, and in its face, somehow, he saw Arthur. Not the man from the street or the soldier from the photo, but the pieces of a soul, broken and rebuilt, turned into something that should never have existed. Arthur didn't move. He stood between Sundar and the thing, his arms loose at his sides. His voice calm. "You were supposed to sleep," he said softly. The creature paused, its chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. Its fingers twitched, long and clawed, dragging slowly across the wall. "I remember you," it rasped, voice low and broken. Arthur's jaw tightened. "Then you know why I'm here." The creature tilted its head. Its gaze drifted past Arthur, to Sundar, who still stood frozen, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "He is not one of us," the creature said. "He should not see." Arthur stepped forward. "He needs to," he said. "He's the last one left who can stop this." For a moment, the corridor was silent. Then the creature's voice turned softer, almost like a sigh. "There are more," it whispered. "We are not the only ones. I know, Arthur replied, "That's why it ends here." Sundar's heart pounded in his chest. His legs finally moved, taking slow, cautious steps forward until he stood beside Arthur. Asterisk,